I've been a Christian for over 40 years, and during that amount of time, I've had a very active prayer life. And like many Christians, I am very deliberate when I'm praying about practicing the presence of God. That means making myself aware that I'm not just talking to the wall here. I am talking to a real live being, and I make myself aware of that, and I practice the presence. And that's something that we Christians do very deliberately. But there's something else that I do very deliberately that I don't think I've ever heard any other Christians say that they do. And I want to share that with you today. I'm going to talk about it a lot in other sessions to come, but today I want to introduce the idea, and that is that when I'm praying, I try to meditate upon the story of life. And I think of that with a capital S, capital L, the story of life. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. This is a book called, or it's actually a chart called The Wall Chart of History. It says the junior wall chart, but it works perfectly fine for my purposes. What this gives us is various periods of history. So what I've opened to here, for example, is just we're segueing from the so-called Middle Ages to the Renaissance. And you can see there's a picture of the Renaissance. It's actually more than the Renaissance here. In a glance here, you see all kinds of things, because you see there's the Renaissance going on, but there's also the heliocentric or Copernican revolution going on. There's Shakespeare, I believe, and it's the Elizabethan age. There's King Henry VIII, and there's Queen Elizabeth. And so what this does is it gives you a good way of glancing. Of course, it helps if you know the history, but you're glancing at a whole period of time and all the different regions of the world and looking at what is happening there during that period of time. Now, how do I use this? What I like to do, I have this open oftentimes, and even when I don't, I try to just remind myself to think about this. When I'm praying, I'm talking to a God who was there. There's some theological complications to this, because we do say that God himself dwells outside of time, is not restricted by the limitations of time like we are. And yet God, we say, is present with each one of us, no matter where we are in time or space. So when I'm praying to a God who was there with all of these people, whether they knew it or not. What that does for me is a number of things that I'll talk about in subsequent sessions, but the number one thing I want to talk about, or just mention today, is this. It helps me, it helps ground me, it helps remind me what prayer is supposed to be all about. When I come to God, knowing that God is the God of these people from long ago and far away, just as well as God is my God here now. It reminds me that the God I'm talking to has been through a whole lot more than what I'm going through now. That this God I'm talking to has concerns that are much larger than mine in terms of time, in terms of crisis that I may be going through right now. That this God has a whole wider scope than what naturally comes to mind for me. My own petty problems, my own issues, my own concerns are what I bring to God. But it is worthwhile for me to constantly remind myself that the God I'm talking to is a God of all people, in all times, all places. And there's an amazing sense of perspective that brings. I'll talk about that more in other sessions. But for right now, I just wanted to introduce the idea. You might try it. Next time you're praying, try thinking deliberately about the fact that God is the God of all periods of time. And see if it changes at all the perspective that you bring to your prayers.